The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up onto a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, because they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the land. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, because they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they shall be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." A gospel inspired by God. The Niagara Biblical Conference lasted almost 20 years, from 1878 until 1897. It was driven primarily by theologians from Princeton Theological Union who were concerned about two things. They were concerned about assaults on the Bible from within Christianity and from outside of Christianity. At this stage, particularly great German scholars who developed a system called form analysis and literary analysis began to see that the scriptures were not just this monolithic organization of material, and that particularly the core of the Bible, which is the first 5 books, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were not written by one single person, but they could extricate 4 very, very different streams of thought that came at various stages of Jewish theology, and they call them J, E, P, and D. J are those texts in which God is called Yahweh, or J in German. E are the places in which God is referred to as Elohim, which is a plural word actually for gods. P stood for the priestly material, which was redacted by the priests at some stages, and then D stood for the Deuteronomic. Deuteronomy literally means the second law. So there were 4 very, very different strands of material that were woven, apparently seamlessly, particularly into the first 5 books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And these scholars really upset the people in Princeton and the kind of fundamentalist Christian thinking. And so that was the first enemy, an enemy from within, which was somehow taking issue with biblical inerrancy, that the Bible wasn't just the Word of God. And the second attack was coming from outside, because in the late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, science was coming into its own, and unfortunately, it was an atheistic kind of a science. And so these scholars are trying to defend the Bible against 2 sources. So they got together over a period of 20 years, and finally they came up with 5 tenets that they asked all of the great Protestant denominations to get behind. And they called them the 5 fundamentals. And that's the origin of the word around religion, fundamentalism. And they said, can you get behind these 5 concepts, and then we can unite against these German scholars in Europe and these atheistic scientists in the United States. And the 5 fundamentals they came up with were that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, and it is literally true. Every single word is literally true. Secondly, that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. Thirdly, that there is only salvation through Jesus Christ. Fourthly, that Jesus rose physically from the dead. And fifthly, that all his miracles were actually miraculous works. They were the 5 fundamentals. On the basis of that, they started to contend with the Germans on one hand and scientists on the other. The scientific thing would take off particularly around the 1925-26 with the Scopes monkey trial. So this was the beginning of the notion of fundamentalism. So that's what I want to talk about today for a few minutes. I'm going to make 4 main points today. I'm going to talk about fundamentalism in its many guises. And then we're going to talk about the centralization of power. And then thirdly, I'm going to say, blessed are the meme makers. And then fourthly, I'm going to look at COJ and its many cosmologies. So they're the 4 points I make this morning. So the first one, fundamentalism in its many guises. So fundamentalism is not just an artifact of religious thinking. You find it in all facets of life. And there are basically 4 parts to fundamentalism wherever you find it. And the first part is you take something which is really, really, really complex, like God, and you reduce it down to a few simplistic dogmas. That's the first stage always in fundamentalism. The second thing is you have to identify an enemy. The third thing is you must dehumanize the enemy. And the fourth thing is then you must make war on this dehumanized enemy of yours. So there are the 4 stages that you find in fundamentalism wherever you find it. Now I just mentioned what the Protestant version looked like, the 5 fundamentals. There's a Catholic version of fundamentalism as well. And the Catholic version of fundamentalism looks like the notion that there's a man in Rome who's infallible. We call him the Pope. The second fundamental in Catholicism is that somehow, God, the infinite source of all that is basically just a rubber stamp. And on the basis of biblical prophecy that says, "Tu es Petrus et super hanc Petra edificare ecclesia mem," you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, and whatever you decree on earth will be decreed in heaven. As if God were just this rubber stamp that the Pope holds in a drawer in the Vatican, and he thinks up some idea, and he puts God's stamp on it, and God says, well, he said, whatever you say, I say. That's the second fundamentalist in Catholic thinking. And the third one is, extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. So the Protestants were bad enough. The Protestants believed that outside of Jesus Christ, there was no salvation. Catholicism went one better. And it wasn't just belief in Jesus Christ, it had to be in accordance with what the Catholic Church said about Jesus Christ. And then fourthly, the fourth one was that the Catholic Church could decide where you spent eternity, above or below. So that was the Catholic version of fundamentalism. But all of the religions have had their versions. There's a fundamentalist version of Judaism. There's certainly a very vibrant and dangerous version of Islam right now. There was a fundamentalist version of Buddhism. There was a fundamentalist version of Hinduism. All of the great religions have gone through their fundamentalist phases or their fundamentalist sectors. It doesn't just belong to Christianity. But it doesn't even just belong to religion. It comes in many, many guises. There is a fundamentalist science, which I would call scientism. The belief system that if we can't measure it with our instrumentation, it doesn't exist. That's fundamentalism. There's a fundamentalism around what I call educationalism. In educationalism, that would say, children should be seen and not heard. And we take that as education. There's a fundamentalism that comes through in the corporatocracy, corporatism. The notion of you give all your money to the very, very rich people and they look after the rest of us. A kind of a trickle-down, economics. That's a version there. There's a version in the military that says something like, if you want peace, prepare for war. That's fundamentalism at its worst. There's a fundamentalism attached to nationalism, the notion that we're always the good guys. So right across the board, you're going to find versions of fundamentalism in all of the disciplines. That's my first point this morning. Second point then, concentration or centralization of power. If you want to make war, centralized power is really, really good. That's why the Romans were so effective. That's why the Sumerians could build an empire. That's why the Babylonians could build an empire. That's why the Persians could build an empire. That's why the Egyptians could build an empire. That's why the Greeks could build an empire. That's why the Romans built an empire, and the Portuguese built an empire, and the Spaniards built an empire, and the English built an empire, and we're attempting to build our own empire right now through the centralization of power. Whenever that happens, you're in big, big danger. So if you really want peace and you really want people to flourish, the decentralization is the way to go. The Romans, again and again, the Roman armies were constantly defeated by the Celts in Europe. But the Celts had no centralization. Each warrior was a law unto himself. So they could never maintain the long-term victories. They got the individual battles, but they never got the war because the Romans were centralized. So if your agenda is about warfare, centralize. If your agenda is about peace, decentralize. It was one of the reasons why, of all the tribes in Kenya, the British could never conquer the Kalenjin. The Kalenjins had no chiefs. So when the British went to any other tribe, they could either threaten the chief or bribe him, and then they owned the group. The Kalenjin had no chiefs. When there was a war party to be led, somebody would be appointed for the day. When there was a religious ceremony to be engaged in, somebody would be made a priest for the occasion. But there was no designated leaders. So the British had nobody to bribe and nobody to threaten. So if you want peace and you want independence, the way to go is decentralization. If I were to draw a map, a simple graph for you, imagine this is the x-axis of the graph. And imagine this is the y-axis of the graph. And imagine I'm plotting along here, more and more centralization of power in smaller and smaller groupings. As you go further along here, fewer and fewer people own more and more of the power. And you look at this y-axis, and this is about greed and violence and warfare and the breaching of civil rights and human rights. I guarantee you the graph would look something like this. It wouldn't just even be a straight line, it wouldn't even be geometric, it would be asymptotic. The more you conserve power in fewer and fewer hands, the more you're set up for warfare and the breach of human rights. So again and again you see this, and very, very often the people who take that kind of power are the people who are least qualified to have that kind of power. You look through world history, and very, very often, apart from their penchant, their extraordinary ability to identify the archetype of war in the psyche of the nation, to identify the archetype of fear in the psyche of the nation, to identify the archetype of xenophobia in the psyche of the nation, you take those out of it, and occasionally you get a great demagogue, but you never get real leadership. And we've seen evidence of this again and again and again. It's small, unimportant little people with this great ability to speak, or this great ability to touch the shadow side of any culture, and it's there in every culture, and to bring it to the surface and to dress it up in great symbolism. These are the people who have led us into world wars and to ethnic strife. Our history is littered with them. The person who precipitated World War II was a corporal in World War I, with this extraordinary ability to tap the shadow of the German psyche. You look all over Africa, when I lived in Africa, and you look at, for instance, Idi Amin between 1971 and 1979, a man who could identify the archetypal shadow of the Ugandan soul and create genocide on a scale where he murdered more than 500,000 of his own people in an 8-year regimen. You look at Master Sergeant Doe in Liberia. He was just a sergeant in the army, and he led the genocide in Liberia in 1980. You look at what happened when I was still living in Kenya. On the 1st of August, Sunday the 1st of August 1982, there was a coup in Kenya against the sitting president, Daniel Toroitich arap Moi. And it was led by a guy who wasn't even a sergeant. He was a senior private in the Kenya Air Force, a guy called Hezekiah Rabala. And he led a coup to overthrow the government, and he appointed himself president of Kenya and went on the Voice of Kenya radio announcing he was the now president. He lasted exactly 6 hours before he was overthrown. But again and again you see the same tendency, where there's a centralization of power in the hands of fewer and fewer people. The graph of greed and the abrogation of human rights and genocides and warfare take off. So it's very important for us to watch where power is being invested in our times. That's the second one. The third point I want to make is, I call it blessed are the meme makers. So you've heard the word meme probably. A meme is to a culture what a gene is to an organism. So if you take any organism, whether it's a flower, or a buffalo or a human being, we're basically composed of genetic material. They're like the building blocks, like the Lego pieces from which you create full organisms. So each piece of the puzzle adds to the organism. So a meme does that for an entire culture. So a meme is an idea which is building the cultural understanding, the cultural belief system. So memes are the building blocks of the cultures in which we find ourselves. And they can be used well or they can be used badly. So all the great liberation movements have been generated by memes of various kinds. Women's liberation has come from a meme. Animals' rights have come from a meme. Human rights and civil rights in our country have come from a meme. Democracy has come from a meme. So a meme is an idea that takes hold in a culture and begins to spread. But memes also can be very, very dangerous. So I want to paraphrase Socrates, who said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I would say the unexamined meme is certainly not worth embracing. We have to be very, very careful about who sends the stories out there, because the stories create our perceptions of reality. So these memes can build extraordinary beauty, or they can lead us into genocide. The problem in our times is that when you put centralization of power next to the meme makers, and that the people in power are the meme makers, we're in big trouble. And unfortunately in our times, the meme making is done by some kind of an oligarchy that controls our media. So we're force-fed stuff, which is not about educating us or about waking us up or allowing us to dialogue about what the issues are. It's about entertaining us and distracting us and propagandizing us and making us afraid of other people. It's about xenophobia and anxiety and anger. It's trying to create an enemy, dehumanize the enemy, and set the dogs of war on the enemy. We have to be really, really careful who our meme makers are. In the olden days, the great meme makers of the village were the shanachis, the storytellers. They were the ones who propagated the ideas for a little community. At a national level, the meme makers tend to be the politicians. They're the ones who set the dialogue that we all tend to believe. And at an international level, they're either the great big religions of the world, or they're the kind of the empires of the world, and they create the memes that the rest of us just swallow hook, line, sinker. We have to be really, really careful what memes we espouse. And my fourth point is this. I'm going to talk about COJ and our many cosmologies. So it is very, very important for us. Every single one of us needs an understanding, a cosmology of where we are. So as I see us plotting our way forward in these fractious times, in these great exciting times, the first thing I'm advocating is that we must be very, very careful about ever slipping into any kind of fundamentalism, either in our religious thinking or in our political thinking. The universe, as citizens of the cosmos, we're being invited to embrace the ineffability of the mystery of life, rather than simplistically reduce it down to a few dogmas that we mouth in 10-second sound bites in our political belief systems or in our religious understanding. To eschew all forms of fundamentalism that reduce the complexity and the beauty of life down to simplistic, dogmatic utterances. The second thing to avoid, I believe, is that in our own government of ourselves, and there are tens of thousands of little groups like us all over the world, that the way in which we dialogue with each other and the way in which we govern ourselves is a democratic model. We've been operating more or less with a Quaker model, where everybody's voice is important, where we're trying to get the sense of the meeting. That is so, so important. That's real democracy, where every person is important to the dialogue. One of the rules of St. Benedict, the founder of Western Christianity, was that all of the monks should listen to the opinions of the youngest member in the group. It's why we need to listen to children. It's why Alfred mentioned this morning, children are probably our greatest teachers, because they ask the really important questions. And so to avoid any kind of centralization of power as a little group ourselves, in our country, in our churches, or in our world. And the third thing to be careful of is, we have to become the meme makers ourselves. We can't depend on the memes given us by people who have a very different agenda, an agenda of war. That we need to be the meme makers ourselves. And I look back at some of the great meme makers of history. I look at people like Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, whose basic meme was a meme of compassion that he articulated in the Four Noble Truths, and that had a huge influence on world culture for a long period of time. I look at somebody like Confucius, possibly the greatest meme maker of all time. If you look at the fact that Confucianist teaching, regulated the life of a third of the world's population for 2,500 years, you could arguably make the case that he was possibly the most effective teacher of all time, or the greatest meme maker of all time. And it was based on the notion of Ren, which is about respect, based on the 5 constant relationships. That every one of us finds ourselves in a relationship between husband and wife, between parents and children, between elder brother and younger siblings, between teacher and student, and between the emperor and the governed. And the sense of separate self, he claimed, was actually an illusion created by the sum of our social roles. It was based totally on respect. There was a meme maker extraordinaire, Kung Fu Tzu. And that was Jesus Christ. This extraordinary teacher whose basic meme was the meme of love and forgiveness. And that's the reason I chose the Beatitudes this morning. These were memes. These were stories that could radically alter human history if they'd ever been tried. Gandhi was asked one time, what did he think of Christianity? He says, it's a great idea. It's a pity it's never been tried. It really was. There was the meme set out by Jesus Christ 2,000 years later. They're still not being promoted, even in our church, let alone in our political system. So we have to, as a community, as individuals, we have to start creating cosmologies that create stories that can make our world excited again in our times. Every one of us is operating according to what I've called a personal cosmology. It's an interior set of belief systems that actually drive your decisions on a day-to-day basis. But for the vast bulk of us, these have been unconsciously acquired. We got it from the mass media, we got it from our parents, we got it from the churches, we got it from the schools. It's unconsciously acquired and it's unconsciously accessed. You put us in a situation and we respond. And I said to you, Susan, why did you say that? And you said, it seemed like the right thing to say. Jane, why did you do that? It seemed like the right thing to do. So it's the right thing to do because we've been impregnated by society by saying that's how you should speak, that's how you should act in this kind of situation, without ever examining the evidence for these memes of ours. So it's so important for us that on an individual basis we create personal cosmologies that propagate memes that lead to love in our times, in our world. So I'm going to propose a kind of an exercise. I want you at some stage during this week to try and differentiate between your ideals and your values. We tend to use these interchangeably as if they were synonyms. I think they're very different. Ideals are how we would behave if we were actually working at the top level of our abilities. Values are the compromises we make with our ideals on the day-to-day practical living. And there's a big difference between them. So I think, for instance, my favorite example is the Declaration of Independence. This extraordinary document that I think should be part of Scripture, that starts off by saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's the ideal on which this country was founded. What were the values of the time? Very different. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, as long as these men aren't black, or as long as these men aren't women, or as long as these men aren't savages. And that's the term used within that same document for the Native American Indian population. So the ideals are all men are created equal. The values are, how can we work our farmlands if we don't have slaves? What's going to happen if we give women the vote? It'll be crazy making. What will happen if we acknowledge that these people lived in this country before us? And so there's a huge discrepancy between the values that actually drive our behavior and the ideals that we put in our documents. And it took us about 250 years to try to bridge some of those differences. It took over 100 years for women to get the vote to right. It took nearly 160 years before blacks in our country had equal rights. And so only now we're beginning to understand the Native American kinds of wisdom. So we're trying to shrink the gap between our ideals and our values. So here's the exercise I propose. Sometime during this week, pick out 3 of your top ideals, not your values, your ideals. And then for each of these ideals, pick out some historical figure, a real person or a fictional character who epitomizes each one of these ideals. It might be something like compassion, Mother Teresa, or peace, Mahatma Gandhi, or courage, Martin Luther King Jr., whatever. And for each value, say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would I grade that person? If it was compassion, for instance, Mother Teresa, on a scale of 1 to 10, how compassionate was she? An 8 or a 9 or whatever. And on that same scale, how would I grade myself? And look at the gap between their grade and my grade, and then create some kind of plan to bridge the gap on these 3 ideals so that your values are moving toward your ideals. And then you begin impregnating the energy of our planet with memes that lead to love and peace. It used to be said that ideals are like the stars. We navigate by them, but we can never reach them. That's no longer true. Very shortly, we will actually be reaching the stars astronomically in our travel. There is absolutely no reason why, if we can reach the stars physically, that we shouldn't reach our ideals energetically. This is the time, and our planet badly needs it, when we need to reach for and incarnate the value of Christ consciousness.